Evolution of global empathy. In the tumultuous landscape of global affairs, where conflicts and crises seem to abound, the world had become somewhat desensitized to the constant barrage of news. For months, the coronavirus pandemic had dominated headlines, capturing the attention of millions and shaping the collective narrative. But as the war between Russia and Ukraine escalated, it rapidly replaced the pandemic as the central focus of international news cycles, thrusting the world into a new era of turmoil and uncertainty. The initial outbreak of the coronavirus had brought the world to a standstill. The daily news updates painted a grim picture of rising infection rates, overwhelmed healthcare systems, and the mounting death toll. Nations scrambled to implement lockdowns, borders closed, and people were forced into isolation. The pandemic consumed conversations, fueled fears, and dominated the public consciousness. However, in the midst of this global health crisis, geopolitical tensions between Russia and Ukraine flared once again. The simmering conflict, which had been lingering on the edges of news coverage for years, suddenly took center stage. The world watched as the situation rapidly escalated, leaving no room for the pandemic to remain at the forefront of public attention. As the war unfolded, the media narrative shifted almost overnight. The headlines that had once been dominated by infection rates and vaccine rollouts were now filled with reports of military offensives, territorial disputes, and the plight of civilians caught in the crossfire. The coronavirus, once deemed the greatest threat to humanity, took a backseat to the human tragedy unfolding in Eastern Europe. The global community's focus shifted from social distancing and mask mandates to discussions of geopolitical alliances and the consequences of the conflict. Governments faced difficult choices as they weighed their responses, considering the potential impact on their own interests and alliances. News outlets scrambled to adapt their coverage, redirecting resources to provide on-the-ground reporting from war-torn regions. As the war replaced the pandemic narrative in news cycles worldwide, the psychological toll on individuals was significant. People who had spent months fearing an invisible enemy suddenly found themselves grappling with the visceral reality of armed conflict. The sense of dread and uncertainty that had pervaded society during the pandemic morphed into a different kind of anxiety, one born out of the fear of war and the destabilization of global order. But amidst the chaos, a peculiar dynamic emerged. The shift from pandemic to war coverage seemed to awaken a renewed sense of collective empathy and urgency. While the pandemic had initially brought people together in a shared struggle against a common enemy, it also bred division and skepticism. Conspiracy theories, misinformation, and political polarization had eroded trust and fueled social unrest. In contrast, the war between Russia and Ukraine presented a different kind of threat, one that was visible, tangible, and rooted in human conflict. The images of destroyed cities, displaced families, and wounded soldiers struck a chord with people around the world. It transcended borders and ideologies, uniting individuals in their collective horror and a growing sense of unacceptability over the senseless loss of life. As the war dragged on, public opinion underwent a gradual evolution. The incessant reports of casualties and atrocities eroded the initial support many had felt for their chosen side. The stark reality of the conflict shattered the illusions spun by governments and media outlets, forcing people to confront the devastating consequences of war. A movement for peace began to emerge, fueled by a growing consensus that the cost of human life and suffering had reached an unacceptable threshold. Protests and demonstrations sprouted in cities large and small, demanding an immediate cessation of hostilities. Grassroots organizations and activists rallied behind the cause, amplifying their collective voice for peace. The media played a pivotal role in this evolving narrative. Journalists and news outlets shifted their focus to the human stories behind the statistics, capturing the resilience of individuals caught in the crossfire. These stories fostered empathy and compassion among audiences, eroding the narratives of us versus them and reinforcing the universal value of human life. Governments, too, felt the weight of public opinion. The growing global sentiment against the war pushed political leaders to seek diplomatic solutions, to engage in dialogue rather than perpetuating the cycle of violence. Nations that had once shown unwavering support for one side or the other were forced to reconsider their positions. The international community recognized the urgency of finding a peaceful resolution to prevent further loss of life. As the war finally came to an end, the legacy it left behind was one of profound lessons learned. The scars, both physical and emotional, would take generations to heal. But the world had emerged from this crucible of suffering with a renewed commitment to peace and a profound understanding of the futility of violence as a means to an end. The Russia-Ukraine war had replaced the coronavirus pandemic narrative in news cycles around the world, reshaping the global order and capturing the attention of millions. In its wake, the world evolved. The memory of the conflict remained etched in collective memory, serving as a poignant reminder of the consequences of unchecked power and the value of every human life. And it was through this understanding, born out of a deepening empathy and a shared yearning for peace, that the arc of humanity bent toward a future that rejected the acceptability of violence and embraced the pursuit of a more compassionate and harmonious world.